What's up, everybody? My name is George Kors, and today I want to talk to you about Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade. This novel is near and dear to me. This is a really important novel in my trajectory as a person and as a novelist. This novel right here by Assia Djebar was an extremely influential work on me, and has a lot of influence on my novel Always the Wanderer, which I'll talk about today. But I want to focus on Assia Djebar because Assia Djebar, in this translation of Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, which is rendered wonderfully into the English by Dorothy Blair from the original French, um, to me, this is one of the most important post-colonial novels out there. And I do think, it is sort of my sort of may perhaps expert opinion, that I think Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is probably one of those novels that needs to be talked about much, much more widely than it is. When we're talking about, not just the post colonial, but also, novels that focus on colonial histories, revolution, identity politics, and the narrative of the other. I do believe that Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is one of those novels that stands above most. Um, this novel is a very very unique one. It is not a straightforward read. I would say it's very experimental, and I've recommended this novel a few times on the channel. I do think the way that Jabbar renders the colonial and the Algerian histories here, along with her own personal histories, is incredibly artfully done. It sort of goes without saying that this is one of those novels that I think is complicated enough that it really does merit a really wide read by a wide range of folks. And Assia Djebar, to her sort of talent as a writer here, is constructing something very very thoughtfully, and you can see the novel is in three parts, and as you go through and you sort of begin to get into the flow of the novel, we realize as readers that we're seeing a lot of very intentional terminology, that is historical in nature, philosophical in nature. There's a lot of intersectional feminist theory within the text here. That sort of goes without saying. I would say, let that be one of the assumptions that you have in delving into a novel like this. The other thing that I would, say, and really comment on here is that this is a very unique blend that you're not going to experience with a lot of other novels. And I think, especially for my folks who enjoy experimental literature, but for folks who enjoy historical fiction as well, and if you enjoy biography as well, so the circle keeps expanding here, I do think that this is a novel that is extremely, extremely worth your while. And that is because Assia Djebar in this slim text, it is less than 225 pages long. It's pretty slim. Is able to construct one of the most complicated blends, one of the most complicated hybrid texts that I perhaps have ever read. And that is using historical fiction, a sort of proto autofiction that is kind of like a fictionalized biography in the first person, and then a greater social commentary woven in throughout all of that. And let me just say that it is exceptionally well done. That Assia Djebar here has achieved something in the literary capacity that few folks do. And I think that is really really provocative for me, and it has been a great source of inspiration and reflection for me as a person, as an artist, and a thinker to engage with this novel. And that concept of the hybrid text, we see this sort of time and again when we see novelists use maybe the trappings of genre fiction in their literary fiction. One person I can think of off the top of my head is Thomas Pynchon, who uses very frequently detective novel type stuff in the text. And we this is not necessarily uncommon with our postmodernists. This is something that we see quite a bit. However, what Assia Djebar is doing is taking this to another level where there are what appear to be, and in some cases are, direct quotations from historical documents within the text. There is direct sort of autobiographical content here. There are fictionalized situations of his well-known historical figures. You might think a la Tolstoy, for example. All of this is going on in the text, and it's very, very fluid. These elements are not necessarily rigidly separated from one another, but they flow from one section to the next. And we see this great blending of things. And to me, on an artistic level, I think Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is a really provocative and very well executed example of intersectional feminism. Just in the way that the text portrays all of the different cultural elements that are going into the Algerian colonial histories. And I use the plural intentionally there because one of the ways that we explore the colonial histories of Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade with Assia Djebar is understanding the multitude of these histories, not just in how it affects individuals and multiple individuals, but also how the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish colonization of Algeria preceded and set the precedent for the separate French invasion and then subsequent brutal colonization of Algeria. And this longer revolutionary history relating to and reacting to and interacting with these different cultures that are present as a result of these colonial histories. This is a complicated and beautiful text. And let me just say, I talked a lot just now sort of theoretically about what's going on in the text. But let me also just say that the language is beautiful. I think Dorothy Blair does an exceptional job in the translation here. And I think it is just exceptionally beautifully written and rendered very well into the English. And if you have read this in the original French, I want you to comment down below, because I have a sneaking suspicion that this is a very beautiful novel. I have never read another novel translated from the French that has made me want to learn French. Folks on the channel know that I speak fluent German and read German fluently. I would love to speak Spanish fluently, but this is the one text that has gotten me there with the French. I want to read the French because of it. And there's so much going on here. Sort of talking about that hybrid text situation here, that might seem a little bit more complicated. So I want to unpack that a little bit more for us here. Because I think that is really important. And I think visually, just how the chapters are arranged and the titles of the chapters, I think the reader will get that. And then I think also thematically, you'll begin to understand, because we have so many polyphonic voices throughout all three parts of the novel here, that you are going to experience the varying histories and identities that are present within the text. It's guaranteed. There's a few things that sort of move through the text that are through lines I think really tie together those disparate elements and those varying characters and their varying experiences. One that I really thought was incredible was the use and commentary on silence. You'll see how I took copious notes on this right here. And that silence versus musicality is a huge dichotomy here in the text, because the cavalcade, the Fantasia, is a very loud experience. It is an extremely loud sort of expression. And in contrast to the Fantasia, we see characters silenced all the time in their various different roles and expectations and histories. And that sort of duality, moving between those two separate elements, is really important here, and I think it is really, really fantastic. Um, so I would say, when it comes to, setting our expectations for the novel, I think, allowing yourself to go with the flow here. I hate to sort of say that in a cliched way, but there is a distinct sort of musicality and flow that goes throughout the text that is intentionally structured by Djebar to allow those readers to move through these different narratives. And there's a ton of them in here. And let me just warn readers as well. This is an extremely brutal novel that has some extremely brutal violence in it. I mean, and that might be something that we set our expectations for anything that we're talking about that is speaking about colonial or imperial histories, that there is an assumed amount of violence and brutality that goes into that. That said, the text itself, as it moves through that structure, I think you might not get super lost, even though there's so many different characters. And I think the polyphonic aspect of a text can be overwhelming for folks. It can be difficult for our readers to say, okay, there's 65 different characters in this novel. Just example, I don't know how many are in Fantasia, but there's dozens and dozens of characters in this novel. It's under 250 pages long. How am I supposed to know what matters, who goes where? And I think a thing I would encourage readers of Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade for the first time to consider is just allow those voices to be heard. This is part of the art experience, is just being uncomfortable in the fact that there are so many voices. That's fine. Let yourself hear them. You can contextualize and think about it after the fact, and you should, of course. As a critical reader, you will do that, I'm sure. But let yourself hear them. The voices are really important here. And it's a super big deal to recognize and contextualize all the different voices in here, because not only are there a ton of different voices in here, but the narrative here takes place over a century. The narrative, it does take place over an extremely long amount of time. So you might be sitting at home watching me saying, George, I do not understand how I can make anything out of a novel that's 200 pages long, is over a century of history, and has so many different elements in it. But trust me, you will get so much out of it. It is really, really worth your while. One of the biggest and most overwhelming and important things I would encourage you to think about when you are reading Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade by Assia Djebar is another sort of theoretical concept. And I know I'm laying it on thick today, and I try not to be super academic on the channel, but just bear with me here, folks. And this is the concept of the orientalist canon. And for my folks, one of my recommendations, I'm going to recommend it early for folks today. I usually recommend it at the end, but one of my recommendations of a related reading is Orientalism by Edward Said. This is a seminal text in post-colonial thinking, and I know a lot of folks have probably read this out there, and you're probably familiar with it. And Edward Said's concept of creating this Orientalist canon, which is a large intellectual European project, and American project for that matter, that seeks to define the other. So what we're thinking of with Said's Orientalism is seen developing in Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade. These two texts are deeply interrelated and definitely are in a place where, if you read one and then the other in whichever order that you want, you're going to have a lot of light bulbs and exclamation points popping off above your head, and I think this concept of the Orientalist canon is a very important one to Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, because what Djebar does here with different historical characters and different historical documents is portrays how the French are authoring Algeria, how the French are authoring Algerian identity, Algerian culture, as part of the colonialist project. Now, Said gives us ample philosophical and critical tools to understand how this is created and what eventually the political ramifications are of that sort of Orientalist canon. So the canon is this, this abstraction that we create of here is art, media, journalism. In our case, in the contemporary day, we might say literature, social media, journalistic output, films, TikToks, whatever, right? All of this content, all of this broad material that is applied about one subject, we see very clearly portrayed here how different French historical characters actually talk about historical events, individuals, Algerian culture, the list goes on. And what they're doing is they're constructing a, let's say, academic edifice that is seeking to define the other from the metropole. The metropole is the center of the colony, the head. So in this case, Paris, right? So where the power is coming from, and then they seek to define the colonized outside. This is an exercise of cultural power in the intercultural exchange. And I do not know of another novel out there, and I have read a ton of post-colonial literature and gotten a graduate degree in it, and I do not know of another work that portrays the Orientalist canon and how it's constructed better and more thoughtfully than this novel. In that sense, Djebar is unmatched. And if you are a philosophy person out there and you're really interested in intercultural exchange and the complexities of how that works, Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is probably one of the most important novels you might ever read in your life. I know it is definitely one of the most important novels I've ever read in my life. Because the way that these philosophies work, and don't get me wrong, I don't want to split hairs here. Intercultural exchange and the related philosophies to it, post-colonialism, feminism, these philosophies are some of the most timely and important philosophies being discussed and debated and affecting our societies across the globe right now, this very moment that you're watching this video. It's time. It's time that we give Assia Djebar credit where credit is due. A fantastic novelist who portrays the creation of those intellectual objects, novels, journalistic articles, paintings, so on and so forth. All of those go into the Orientalist canon. All of those attempt to define the other. They attempt to define other cultures. They attempt to exercise power. All right? And one of the things I might encourage you to think about is, when we're thinking about intercultural exchange and who views what and who can say what, this is a really complicated discussion. I know here in the United States, for example, cultural appropriation has been a hot topic of discussion for a few years now. Probably the last 5 or 6 years, it has been very popular on social media to talk about this. And one of the ways that we think about this is by looking at what lens are we viewing this individual through. So who mediates the viewing of this cultural event, language, idea, person, food, religion, cultural practice, so on and so forth, right? Who mediates that? Who has authored this? It's a really important question. You're asking the right questions if you're asking yourself that. And the way that Djebar approaches that in Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is so nuanced that I think it really does add a layer of detail to our thinking about those questions that is really, really important. The other sort of more theoretical aspect that I would say about this text that I think is really important, and is also another extremely timely one, is the discussion of the other. So the other, I've been using this phrase throughout the video so far, but the other as this individual who is not part of the hegemonic culture, who's not part of the accepted inner circle, who possesses power, and that they are outside of that. In this case, if we're looking at the political Parisian as being the insider of the culture that's exerting power, and then we look at the Algerian revolutionary as the outsider, so that might be the other in that case. There's so much direct and intentional commentary on othering and the other as a concept in this novel that I think if that is something that is of interest to you, even if maybe colonial histories aren't a big part of what you're interested in reading about, I think that that would be really valuable for you, because the way Djebar just is able to subtly construct commentary on the other is extremely well done. I gotta say, I like to compliment my fellow novelists on the channel here, and I gotta say, Djebar is doing a fantastic job here of weaving in these really complicated philosophies surrounding extremely complicated intercultural exchanges. One thing that I haven't talked about yet here, that I think now is a good time to sort of bring up here, is one of the things that we're focusing on in the text here is the initial French colonization in the 1840s of Algeria, and that sort of 19th century colonial project, and then the Algerian Revolution that happens in the 20th century. These two extremely violent situations are a major crux of the sort of musical flow of the narrative here. And with those two situations in mind, our looking at how the other is initially constructed at the onset of the colonial project versus how the other is constructed at the end when the revolution is starting, this is a really important back and forth for us, because we see a century go by, over a century, of history, of individual experiences, of collective communal experiences throughout this colonial experience. And in that case, the definition of other changes and morphs, while still retaining some of those initial ideas and sort of expressions of identity from the onset of the French colonization. It morphs and changes into a new sort of historical expression of the other. And I think that's really, really timely. It's really important. We think about our own cultures in such complicated ways. We think about our own histories in such complicated ways, and it's really important. And Djebar is a complicated figure in all of that, because this novel is being authored in the French. It is being authored in the language of the colonizer. And what's more is we're seeing, these biographical statements from Djebar talking about going to the French school, learning about French culture, being in France, interacting with French individuals. We see really complicated portrayals of individual French colonizers who assume Algerian cultural aspects, who interact with Algerian culture in complicated ways. This stuff is the meat and potatoes, to use another cliche, of this sort of philosophical discussion of intercultural exchange. It's really important. It's really, really important. And for folks in the United States, think about our intercultural exchanges here. I know the city where I live in is extremely diverse, has folks from all over the world in it. And, we might be seeing these really complicated intercultural exchanges happening on a day-to-day basis. And they are portrayed time and again here in Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, as is that really brutal colonialist history. It's, on a human level, I think, it's something that we might be inclined, because of the violence of the colonial projects of previous centuries and of course the imperialist projects of the current century. We might be inclined to be reductive about them and characterize them in a really either or sort of situation where, we say, okay, violence bad, this bad. And the colonialist project that the French exercised in Algeria was unbelievably brutal and bad. However, there's so much nuance that we need to dig into there that the situation demands. It's so complicated in how it shapes a person's identity that we owe it to ourselves to dig into the nuance there. We know that this is bad. Let's continue digging here and see what we can get out of it and see what we can learn about ourselves as humans. Because I think Djebar, for all intents and purposes here, for me, when I'm looking at the accomplishments of a novelist, Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade might be one of the crowning achievements of the novel in and of itself. Not only in its experimental form, but also in the sense that she achieves this depiction of hybrid identity in a way that I don't know a lot of people can achieve. There's so much nuance here, and it is really done so poetically, that you just have to give Jabbar credit for creating this masterpiece. It really is one of the most astounding novels I've ever read, and I'm proud to amp it up here on the channel because it deserves to be more widely read. The novel itself is in three parts. Now, parts 1 and 2 are deeply interrelated. Of course, all three parts are interrelated, but parts 1 and 2, in terms of their structure, are more interrelated. This bouncing back and forth between past and present. We are establishing the hybrid identities here, and we're establishing the colonial histories. So we're talking about, the French colonial history. Of course, this is also a situation where we're talking about the Turkish colonial history here, and those interplays. And I think parts 1 and part 2 prepare you for part 3, because part 3 is this large, sort of climactic moment in the novel that has all these voices. This is where the polyphony, and we've talked about this a lot on the channel, the polyphony, the multitude of voices, becomes really, really, really loud. And this is where, the revolution becomes loudest. And I'm going to show you just what the chapter titles are in part 3, because part 3 itself is only about 100 pages long. It's about half the novel. And this has an extremely musical structure. So I just want to show folks on the channel here how this looks. So you see we've got these movements listed here, and then we've got voices. And all of this is so intentionally constructed. It's really, really incredibly beautifully done. I keep complimenting Djebar here. I feel like I'm losing track of the novel because I keep wanting to say, she just does such a fantastic job. But I can't say it enough. And that third part is really affecting. The way that it is constructed, almost like a piece of music, it's incredibly done. And it's very, very beautiful. And we reach this crescendo in the third part that, few novels get to have this, that is just flawlessly executed. And for my experimental novelist lovers out there, for my folks who like that sort of fiction, that is deeply complicated in the way that it's structured on the page, I don't think you should sleep on Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, because, to be frank with folks, the way that Djebar experiments with language here is of the highest order. I mean, I'm talking about, this is like whoever your favorite experimental novelist is out there, Djebar is right there with them, and I'm including James Joyce, Arno Schmidt, whoever you think does it for you. Djebar is right there with them, guaranteed. And I say that with every bit of expertise I can possibly muster, because this text is so carefully constructed, and the way that you move between voices, the way that you move with the language, unbelievable. I mean, it is unbelievably well done. And there is another layer here that philosophically creates an even more complicated take that we can have here, which applies to some fellow experimental novelists, but not to all of them, which is that Djebar is writing in the language of the colonizer and comments on language throughout the text. This is another through line. Just like I mentioned, silence is a through line throughout the text here. The commentary on which language of the multitude of languages, Berber, Arabic, French, Turkish, and so on, of the multitude of languages, who comments where, and how Djebar comments, that itself is a layer that I just have to say of consideration in the text, consideration in the novel that pushes this text beyond what most novels are doing. It is so well done, because when we think about, language, we have to think about language as a tool, as a cultural object, as a religious object. We have to think about it in these multitude of ways. And in this case, we have to think about French as a tool of the colonizer. You know, Man, I mean, this is some of the most thoughtful writing out there, folks. I mean, really, it is. And I want to encourage you, please, to strongly consider taking up this novel. And one of the reasons is because of the commentary on language. If you've been around the channel for a while, you know that I really, really love reading in translation. It's really important to me. You also know that I love reading in the original German. So, to me, what language we read in, even if you only read in one language, and I don't want you to feel like weird because you're only reading in English, only reading in Spanish, or only reading in German or French or Arabic or Chinese or whatever language it is that you read in. It is about the thought behind how we read. And to me, Djebar is getting her readers to a place where they are really seriously considering what languages have which functions in a sociological, anthropological, and sort of psychological sense in relation to the colonialist project. That, I think, for me, looking at an experimental novel that experiments with form, that experiments with all sorts of different kinds of expression and poetry in the text to try and elicit different feelings from the reader that a traditional form of the novel might not necessarily accomplish. That layer of which language functions where all of a sudden becomes that much more complicated, and it really enriches the text. Up front in the text here, we have a glossary. Now, this glossary includes words from multiple languages, from the Arabic and from the Turkish as well. And, to me, having this large glossary here really prepares the reader, really gets you to a place as a reader where you understand just the multitude of different languages that are going to be in play here, and why that's important. And this goes back to what I was commenting on with the orientalist canon and our friend Saeed here. The orientalist canon is this construction of, art objects, journalism, so on and so forth, but it's also a construction of language. It's a construction of how the French language in this case is used to describe. That might involve coinage, creating new terms. That might involve borrowing from other languages. Might involve borrowing from Arabic or Turkish, for example, or Berber. It might involve borrowing from these different languages. And then we are constructing the sort of sociolinguistic conditions to describe the other. So we're seeing how this is all interrelated, right? This is so complicated, and you might be you might be 30 minutes into this video and be like, okay, George, I get it, whatever. But I want to encourage you to really take this novel seriously, because I love it. It is one of the most important novels that has ever come across my eyeballs, ever. It is super duper important. So let's talk about I mentioned earlier on that this was a hugely influential novel for me, and in my first work, Always the Wanderer, from Golden Antelope Press. And one of the reasons why is because I see an enormous amount of utility in how Djebar has different characters along different timelines who don't interact with each other. I think that is a revelation for me in terms of how authors create those interconnections between narrative, and I think that is very avant-garde here. And that, to me, was one of the biggest takeaways for Always the Wanderer, was that our characters don't necessarily need to interact. They don't need to be along the same timeline. I know this is complicated, but it doesn't have to be. We can just allow the flow of the artistic object to go with us. In Always the Wanderer's case, the three protagonists don't ever interact. They don't ever see or meet each other. And the reason is because they don't need to. And the elements that connect them are cultural, they are sociological, they're psychological, they're emotional, they're philosophical. And Jabbar, I don't know of another novelist who accomplishes that in a better way. And for me, as a writer, that was a huge revelation. And a little peek into my own psychology about how Always the Wanderer was written. I think I owe a lot to Assia Djebar, allowing yourself as an artist to have those different voices interact with each other in different ways is a tough task. I mean, ask anybody who is a novelist, short story writer. How are we going to get these two, these three, these four, these five individuals to be connected, even though on a very superficial level they are not? It's tough stuff. And if you are a novelist out there or a writer and you want to learn, or a journalist even, journalists especially probably should be reading a book like this, given the commentary on journalism here. But, if you want to learn how those interconnected aspects of humanity can be portrayed really, really incredibly, Assia Djebar puts on a masterclass here. Gotta say it. Let's talk about some recommendations. So I've already recommended Orientalism by Edward Said. Let's talk about a couple of others here that I want to highlight, and I'm just gonna put. Let me just put some of these books here real quick. I think first off, and this is another really really important novel to me. Both of these are really important novels to me. First is Season of Migration to the North by Tayib Salih, translated unbelievably well by Dennis Johnson Davies. One of the best translations I've ever read. This is a slim novel. It is a novel that is focused so incredibly on this idea of post-colonial identity. I think that this, for you, if you're out there and reading, post-colonial literature is really important to you. I think Season of Migration to the North is probably just like Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, an incredibly important novel. This chronicles a character's experience as they are educated in Europe and then return to Northern Africa, to the Sudan, where they are from, and the ways that affects an individual's identity, the way that university and education as cultural institutions affect and shape identity. It's a big deal here. If you like stoner, you would really like this. And this I think, this I think is one of those novels out there that, again, much like Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, this should be a household name in my opinion. Again, not that I believe in the canon. We can talk about the canon in a colonialist sense, because I think the artistic canon, obviously Orientalist canon, is a way to exert cultural power. Goes without saying. So I don't necessarily believe in the canon, but I do believe that there's novels out there that for me are super duper important. Season of Migration to the North, no doubt, is one of those. Another novel that I think is really important, and I think this, for my American viewers out there, this is a novel that I think you should be reading, is Cities of Salt by Abdelrahman Munif. Munif, this novel here is sort of in an unnamed Persian Gulf kingdom in the 1930s, and Americans come and establish an oil company, and in my opinion, the unnamed Persian Gulf kingdom is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and this is one of the only bits of fiction like this that we have that critically approaches the creation of oil companies a la Aramco in the Arabian Peninsula. and this novel's been banned in Saudi. It's been banned in a lot of other places, and the translation is done very well here by Thoreau. But this novel, I think, is just, if you're talking about American imperialism, if that's something that is of interest to you, or you think about that, I do think Cities of Salt is probably one of the most important novels out there that I don't see a lot of folks talking about when it comes to American imperialist projects. The construction of Aramco in Saudi Arabia was one of the most important American imperialist projects that has ramifications to this day. Cities of Salt is an incredibly beautiful and polyphonic narrative that approaches that. And yeah, I think Peter Thoreau did a great job translating Munif into the English. Another novel that I'm going to recommend, I've recommended it a couple of times on the channel already, is going to be, and this is if you like historical fiction, and if you really are interested in these sort of novels that explore the historical aspects of war, for example. If you're looking for something that's more along the lines of the historical fiction aspects present in Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, my last recommendation is going to be Uncertain Glory by Joan Salih, translated from the Catalan. And it's a really beautiful novel. It's a brutal tale from the Spanish Civil War, translated from the Catalan over, and I think it's messy, that I think is one of the things that Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade does an interesting job of, is these intercultural human exchanges that we have. We might be able to talk about them philosophically in a very tidy way, but really human interaction is more often than not very messy. And I think that Uncertain Glory does a great job of approaching that. Overall, this novel, Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, excuse me, this novel, I think, is just so unbelievably beautiful. It really packs in so much in a short space. And I think, if you like historical fiction, and you've always maybe been on the line about experimental fiction, if you like biography, and you're always a little hesitant to delve into what might be more experimental, Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade might be that introductory novel that you need. It is really slim. It's short. It's got very short chapters, so you're going to be able to take this and go through this in a reading that gets you time to sort of unpack and think it through. If a lot of what I'm talking about is sort of complicated, that intersectional identity thread where we have the hybridity of being Algerian, of being French, of possibly being Turkish, of possibly being that identity of speaking French, speaking Arabic, speaking Turkish, speaking Berber, whatever. These are really complicated aspects for us to think about in any fiction, of course. And I think the shorter chapters, the shortness of the text itself, can afford you time to really treat seriously what's going on here. Because overall, it is a beautifully done novel, and I think, in my opinion, it is one that is worthy of multiple reads. Every time I approach this novel, I get something from it that's really valuable. So, you have my encouragement. Please read Assia Djebar, read Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, and appreciate just how complicated those narratives can be, and what a fantastic job Djebar does. So let's shout that out, and let's shout out Dorothy Blair for a fantastic translation as well. Overall, one of the most important novels for me, and I hope one day perhaps it'll be one of the most important novels for you. Thank you so much, folks, for being here with me today. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate you taking your time to be here and go through this complicated novel with me, and learn and think about the various stuff that's going on here. I really do think Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade is worth your time, and it's been an enormous influence on me as a novelist. So thank you so much for your time. Please visit georgekors.com. If you want to learn more about me as a person and writer and thinker, you can go to georgekors.com and find out more. You can follow me on socials at gbk7288 that I may or may not use. And you can read my novel, Always the Wanderer, and you would have my eternal gratitude if you did so. And if you like Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade, Always the Wanderer, I'm proud to say that I would recommend this novel after reading Fantasia and Algerian Cavalcade. So have a wonderful day, folks. Thank you so much again. I hope you have a great and safe day, and I will see you folks later. Adios.